Welcome to I'm a Fuel for You, the Excise Tax Podcast.
Good morning, Brian. This is Patrick, your fuel tax guide, fueling your desires.
That's naphtha gonna happen.
Anybody with a burning question, be sure to call in or email us at pwm97128@gmail.com. That's Patrick Whiskey Michael 97128@gmail.com.
And keep it clean, no profanities.
Unless the pictures are high quality.
I was wondering about fuel excise tax and about oil in general. I don't understand that.
Last week we started the discussion about the process of getting fuel. We started with crude coming out of the ground, and its various crude oil is actually a solution made up of many different liquids, and each having different components. And crude oil is not one flavor. It's got many different characteristics. Some is very light, some is very heavy, and we're just starting into the refining process. And the caveat is, I'm not a chemist. I don't play one on TV, and I never want to be one. But the chemistry is really pretty well established, being well over a century old, and it uses a simple process of boiling the crude oil. You take crude oil, you put it in a special chamber, and you start heating it. As anybody who's distilled their own vodka knows, you take a solution of alcohol and water, and you warm the solution to a point, and the alcohol will evaporate off.
Because the alcohol's lighter. It's always the lightest stuff that comes off first and the heaviest stuff that stays the longest.
Exactly. So in this situation, you have the lighter fluids and liquids and gases like methane, propane, ethane, butane will boil off first, leaving behind successively heavier products. Naphtha comes off before gasoline, gasoline comes off before diesel, and diesel comes off before fuels oils. And the final component, when you've heated the crude oil over 900 degrees, it no longer will boil off anything, and that residual that remains is asphalt. So that becomes when you let it cool, it becomes a very hard substance that we drive on every day.
But you can heat it up and turn it into a liquid again.
Yes, and you can also dissolve it very easily by pouring gasoline on it, which is why the gas stations are very adamant about putting down absorbent, because otherwise you dissolve away the asphalt pavement.
Oh, I've got to try that sometime just to see what happens.
It may take a little time, but it works. So for our purposes, we're interested in what's called the middle distillates. And the middle distillates include naphtha, gasoline, and diesel. In today's modern cars, they like a very precisely refined product. So in the good old days, they used natural gasoline for the first engines.
That would be the benzene component, or?
Well, benzene is a liquid that is preferable in many ways to gasoline because it's a more complex hydrocarbon and burns more evenly than gasoline. Raw gasoline tends to ignite prematurely. And one of the things in the internal combustion engine is you want a controlled explosion and not a premature explosion. Anybody who's driven on really cheap gas will notice that your car knocks, and that knocking is caused by when the cylinder fills with gas, it then moves into the next stage and compresses the gas. If it ignites before the compression is complete, it causes a knock because it's blowing up before it's at the ultimate compression, and that's hard on your engine.
Uh-huh.
So they take the natural gasoline and they add various components to it to arrive at the desired characteristics. And segueing into a minor topic here, the ASTM, the American Society of Testing Mechanical Engineers, I believe is what it is. ASTM
I don't know.
is the organization. American Society of Testing Materials. That's what it is. It's an engineering association which gathers together and decides what the characteristics are of products. For example, if you want to have alcohol, you can have alcohol that is 1% alcohol and 99% water, or you can have alcohol that's 99% alcohol and 1% of water, and you could market either one of them as alcohol. But in reality, the ASTM standard sets out that alcohol, as they define it, meets their characteristics of having a certain amount of alcohol per quantity of water, and it will have physical characteristics that match criteria such as color of the flame, the amount of soot in the flame, all these different chemical properties that you can test for, and they will include the testing procedures that a chemist would use to actually perform a test to determine if the product actually is alcohol.
That doesn't sound very scientific, but I suppose it works. They've worked it out over time, and a good chemist can tell what a flame should look like.
Well, it's extremely scientific when you start getting into the process, because the ASTM has standards for the tests. For example, if they're doing a flame test, the flame must match there are procedures that they have established that you have to follow in order to determine the color of the flame, the height of the flame, the amount of soot that comes off the flame, and so it's quantifiable and very, very repeatable process, allowing for standardization. And it's that standardization and the quality control of the product that allows us to build high-performance engines today that are much more efficient on a quantity of fuel and much more effective.
I was just thinking about in the old days where diesel fuel came first and gasoline engines only came later, right about the Wright brothers, but it was probably because the storage and transportation of oil was so leaky and open to the air that basically everything boiled off and evaporated, and you weren't left with much but diesel by the time it got to the destination.
If memory serves, gasoline was considered to be an obnoxious waste product because nobody could figure out what to do with it. And you're absolutely right. A diesel engine is a much simpler engine because it operates on a specific program of compressing a vaporized liquid rapidly, and by the application of the pressure, it automatically ignites when you have the mixture of the vaporized fluid and air. If that's in the proper proportion, which is very easy to do, and you compress it rapidly, it will spontaneously ignite, and there's nothing to it. An internal combustion engine with a spark plug, a gasoline internal combustion engine, has a great deal of timing involved, and you have to initiate the spark. It uses a more volatile fluid, gasoline, and so it's a much more complex engine. But you can get more. It's better in certain circumstances. It has a better power range, I believe, is one of the better.
Okay, and there's a tax on gasoline?
Oh, yes. Let's go back to the refinery. We wandered afield there a little bit. So when we are dealing with our refining process, we pull off the naphtha, and we pull off the gasoline, and we pull off the diesel fuel to make the components we want. We mix the naphtha and the gasoline and some other special components like a little bit of butane to make it. By adding gases and thin liquids, you increase the vaporization rate of the liquid under many circumstances, and to get the desired rate, so that so it's going to function properly in your engine. And again, I'm getting over my head, so look it up in your chemistry book. But let's jump ahead. So we've pulled off our gasoline, naphtha, and diesel, and we've put them in different tanks because gasoline, naphtha, and diesel are very similar, but they are different products. Diesel is a little thicker. In fact, there's even diesel 1 and diesel 2, and they are slightly heavier. Diesel 2 being slightly heavier than diesel 1. Diesel 2 being more susceptible to cold temperature will gel or get thick under cold conditions, making it less desirable for places like Alaska or at altitude. Kerosene is very similar to diesel. They're the same base product. You can make diesel out of kerosene by adding a little more lubricating properties. Sulfur used to be used a lot. Sulfur has slight...
Oh, I thought sulfur was something they tried to get out.
Sulfur is a natural component in crude oil, depending on the type of the reservoir. You can have either very little or very much. You were saying, mentioned earlier, that they flare a lot of gas at the oil fields, and a lot of what they flare is the byproducts they don't want, such as hydrogen sulfide and other sulfur compounds, and so the easiest way to get rid of those, the ketones and the sulfur and the byproducts, is just flare them off. But sulfur in itself, when left in fuel, acts as a lubricant, and diesel fuel needs to be of a higher lubricating characteristic than gasoline, based on the nature of the engine.
Oh, okay. Diesel engines still have oil, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But the for whatever reason, the use of the high compression ratio. Diesel engines have very high compression ratios as compared to gasoline engines, and so meaning that
probably destroys the lubricating action.
It does something, and so sulfur in the beginning was somewhat desirable. The unfortunate impact is it forms compounds outside after it's burned that people don't like. So they've gone to great lengths to remove sulfur from fuel, and crude oil. The process of removing sulfur is done by catalysts.
Something reacts with the sulfur and binds to it?
Correct. A catalyst is a compound which incites a desired chemical reaction, such as causing the sulfur to precipitate out or to bind with something else into a compound that is more desirable.
We left off, we had naphtha, gasoline, diesel 1, and diesel 2. I'm familiar with all of those except naphtha. What do you use naphtha for?
Naphtha is a lighter component than gasoline. It is just a liquid. It burns really well. It is a little too volatile. It's not a desired product to work with because of its volatility. It's more hazardous to work with, which sounds funny. So you got to think it's got to be really hazardous if it's more hazardous than gasoline and diesel.
I understand.
It's just a little more difficult to work with.
So we have gasoline and the two diesels, and what happens then?
So the refinery then has separated out the gasoline and the diesel and the naphtha from the crude oil. It then has large tanks of these individual components. Then the chemists get to work and they decide, based on the quality of the product which has come out of the refinery, they are going to combine together additives to make the final product. And this is where the ASTM standards come in, because in order for it to be called gasoline, basically your regular unleaded gasoline has to meet specific ASTM standards.
I see. It's like if you're making Campbell's soup and you're buying soup stock. You might get some soup stock that needs a little more carrots in it, and then other soup stock has enough carrots but doesn't have enough celery in it.
Right. And if you're supposed to have chicken in your chicken soup, there better be chicken. So the ASTM standards give us the criteria that say this product meets the standards and can be called. And one of the services, one of the quality control measures that happens in the petroleum industry is that throughout the distribution system, there's a continual testing to make sure that the fluid that you think you're receiving is actually the fluid that you think you're receiving.
Yeah, I mean, through the whole process, it can change, be drained off, wrong setting on a pipeline somewhere, anything.
Absolutely. If you're expecting to receive jet fuel, if you're expecting to receive 1 million gallons of jet fuel into a tank that already has 10 million gallons of jet fuel, and you receive 1 million gallons of fuel oils, all of a sudden you have a batch of diesel fuel that is no longer within specification and cannot be sold as diesel fuel, and it can be very expensive.
So this is a case where 1 plus 10 does not equal 11.
Absolutely, and you end up in some cases sending the batch back to the refinery to get run through the refinery process again to separate out the two products. And of course that's very expensive. It takes time, money, and it's just not something you want happen, because you may turn out with a product that's worth $3 a gallon and turn it into a product that's worth 50 cents, and somebody eats that difference.
Oh, so it's not as simple as just like taking cheap wine and pouring it in an expensive wine bottle and just selling it as an expensive wine and nobody will notice?
That is the problem, because people all along the way are doing testing. In fact, it's called a certificate of analysis, which is refineries and terminals have chemistry shops on site that do testing, so that if I'm buying a load of diesel fuel, I say I would like a certificate of analysis on that load of diesel fuel, and they will give it to me and say this diesel fuel meets the ASTM standard for diesel fuel, and I can take that and show that to somebody who's buying it and saying this is certified to meet diesel standards.
Well, we're nearing the end of our second podcast, and we really haven't gotten into the excise tax accounting portion yet, but I'm looking forward to that.
It's a fascinating field. There's a lot that goes into this just to understand what's going on, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you.